So we're going to start off with just a basic scene. I've stripped out all the fancy shaders, all the lighting and everything. I've also removed the hair and clothing because the base model is what we're focusing on at the start of this tutorial. So what we're going to do is we're just going to create a skeleton. We're going to build a skeleton which will fit inside her body. We can then bind this model to the skeleton, and that will then allow us to pose the model. So first of all, let's start creating our skeleton. And to do this, make sure you're in your animation menu, go to skeleton and open up your joint tool. I'll just scale this down so we can look at the options. So there are lots of options in here. These options, the degrees of freedom, that basically will limit which way your joint can rotate. So if, for example, your elbow joint, you may only want it to rotate around the y-axis because your elbow doesn't physically rotate around the other axes. For now, we're just going to stick with the default settings, but I'll just give you a quick run through. So degrees of freedom, we'll leave as they are because we want all the joints to be able to rotate in any axis. This here sets the axes of each joint. Your primary axis, secondary axis. Basically, the primary axis is which axis points down the bone, so which one is pointing from one joint to another. We'll leave that as X for now. And the secondary axis is which axis attempts to point straight up. So the world orientation, obviously, is Y, so we'll leave that at Y as well. So we basically want the X-axis to point down the bone, we want the Y-axis to point up, and the world axis, which it should align with, well, as it says there, is Y as well. Obviously you can have plus or minus, or a positive or negative value. We'll leave everything else here. If you're using Maya 2013 but the upgraded extension version, you'll have this symmetry option here. Now I'm not going to use this just in case you're using an older version of Maya, but what I'll do is I'll just quickly demonstrate it. So we just want to mirror across the x-axis, and then let's just switch to our front view. Just move this over here so we can see what we're doing. Just press Ctrl and space just so we can get a full view here. So now we're mirroring across the x-axis. If we place a joint for the arm, for the elbow, for the wrist, you can see it's creating the ones opposite too. And also if we move these or rotate these, it's going to mirror that there too as well. But obviously we're not going to use that tool just now. So let's just bring back our options. Oops, let's just pull that off there. There we go. So we'll turn off symmetry for now, but that's a useful tool there just in case you want to speed up your workflow and create both halves at the same time. So let's just reset that tool. We're going to leave everything at the default settings, and we're just going to start building our skeleton. Now I like to start with the limbs first. The centre of the body is pretty standard. What we're looking at is getting the joints in the centre of the mesh. Now in May 2014, there's a nice tool going to be included which will automatically find the centre of the model for you. So you won't need to check the front, check the top, and adjust the joints that way. But for us, unfortunately, we need to do that. So let's put our shoulder joint about here. And what else we're going to do is we're going to add in extra joints for the bicep. And we're going to create one for the elbow. And we're going to create another joint for the wrist rotate. And then we'll go down to the wrist like so. Now I'm not going to show you me placing every joint. I'm pretty sure you can manage that yourselves. Let's just make sure X-ray joints is on. And what we might want to do is turn on wireframe on shaded just so we can get an idea of where it is. Now these joints need to be exactly in the middle. So what I'm going to do is just check that there's only a value on the translate X, which is fine. You may want to just go to the front and just make sure when you rotate it doesn't wobble at the end like so. So you may need to just go in and tweak these just to make sure they're central. Now that is rotating nicely down to the elbow. So these here may just need slightly adjusting just to fix those. That's a bit better. So our rotation back to 0. So these joints we've added in because if you look at your own body and the way it deforms, it doesn't twist from the shoulder. When you actually twist your arm, it's almost as if it's twisting from this point here. And we don't want the mesh to deform up here when we twist. And if we didn't have this joint, it would be rotating around the x-axis on the shoulder, and you'd end up with some sort of nasty twisting here, and there'd be problems when you come to poser. The shoulder area is always an issue. So we add this bicep joint in here, and what we'll do, but later on when we come to rigor, is this joint, we use the z-axis and the y-axis as it should, but when we rotate the x, we'll trick this rig into actually rotating this joint. So it'll rotate around the biceps here. The same goes on with the wrist. If you twist your wrist, you'll see you can move your wrist around that axis, you can move it around the y-axis, but when you rotate around the x-axis, it doesn't twist around this point here, it twists around this point here. And that's because the radius and ulnar bones, which both come down the upper arm, the forearm here, they actually rotate around each other, and that's what creates that twist. So it's always a good idea, if you can afford the joints, to add in these extra couple here, but make sure they're bang on central. So double check and triple check that when you're rotating, that there's no wobbling at the ends there. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to pause the video, add in the rest of the skeleton. Actually, tell a lie, I'm going to delete this one, and I'm going to bring up one that I made earlier. Here we go. If you're looking at this myosine, it's in this group fix axis, and you'll see why it's called that in a second. So let's turn off the wireframe. So here we've created all these joints for the fingers. We have our bicep and wrist twist. We have a root node there, and for the feet I've just made a basic joint here just to get the ball of the foot rotating, just so we can move the toes up and down. If you feel that you need to, you can go in and add in extra joints for each individual toe. What I've also done, added in a joint for the jaw so that we can have her mouth opening and closing, and we have the head joint here which points out to where she's looking. It's also important to have your clavicle joints, because when you raise your arm doesn't raise to that point. If you raise your arm now, you'll see if you try and raise it without shrugging your shoulder, you can only really raise it to about this point here before it starts to get difficult, and then that's where the clavicle takes over, and that's how your arm naturally rotates. So it's important to have that clavicle joint in too. So this is the skeleton. We've placed all the joints, we've kept them down the centre of the model, just to keep the deformation right. For the spine, for example, if we kept that at the back of the body here, when she bent forward, the front here would collapse in far too much. So it's nice to keep it down the centre.